The next thing that Mike was going to talk about that I'll cover now is customization, which we'll start with doing that via the configuration files. So there's a hierarchy of these configuration files. WeBWorK reads the entire configuration in, and basically the last thing wins. So when you ran the script, you would have put in some settings that went into site.conf. Those are server settings that are specific to your server, and they're the lowest level thing that WeBWorK needs so it can start the web server with the right settings and things like that. Then it goes to defaults.config, and it says here, I say don't edit the file, because when you upgrade to a new version of WeBWorK, that's going to get blown away with a new version of it, and it will lose any changes you've made there, and it'll also complicate your upgrade, which we'll come back to a couple slides from now. So you don't want to make any changes to defaults.config. The alternative is the one past it, which is localoverrides.conf. So anything you want to change for the whole system, you're going to change in local overrides. If there's things you want to change for a specific course, there's two ways to do that. Some of them, the more subtle, esoteric things that you usually don't need to change, you would put in course.conf. For the ones that you may want to change more regularly, we'll put them in simple.conf. So I'm going to switch over here to my WeBWorK server. So this is a brand new server that was installed using the script last night. So there's not a lot going on. I've created one course, but we're going to look starting with the command line. So let's start in opt-WeBWorK. So we'll start in opt-WeBWorK, which is where everything lives. We'll spend some more time on this in a little while when we talk about upgrading, but this is where all of your stuff would have ended up. You see the 5 directories here. Courses, libraries, MountJax, PG, WeBWorK. Everything you do with WeBWorK lives in this directory. Everything that's on the hard drive. So if we want to talk about configuration, the system-wide configuration files all live in WeBWorK2/conf. So quick tour of this, and I know Jeff went through some of this in the first session when we did the under the hood, but now that you've got your own server, you may want to look back at this. Anything that's a .dist here is stuff that was sent out with WeBWorK that you may want to make your own copy of. Some of these you have to. For example, localoverrides.conf.dist. The script, when it ran, would have made a copy of that into localoverrides.conf. Same thing with one of these WeBWorK configs, depending on which version of Apache you're running, would have got copied to just the non-dist version. And the other one is database.conf. Should be, maybe it isn't. So, so you have a few of these conf files. Talking about the 3 that I was just mentioning, there's site.conf. So let's start by taking a look at site.conf. This one's relatively short because it has just the bare minimum needed to get WeBWorK up and running. So there's a bunch of stuff about it if you want to read. Anything without a hash in front of it is an actual configuration item. So you may or may not remember being asked this when you set up the server. It asked for the WeBWorK handler URL and also the server root URL. Because this is just a machine that I'm using as a VM on my local machine, I don't have a real address in there. You were asked for your server user ID and group ID, so a lot of you used www.data or something like that for those. But they would have been set. Again, this stuff, the only reason to change this stuff is if it doesn't work. We'll go to checkmodules.pl in a minute, and it checks a lot of these things. But most of these paths are pretty standard for Linux installations. So you shouldn't need to change most of these external programs unless you have one of these programs that's not in the usual place on a Linux system. Database options, not a lot here that we need to set. Again, if you're using your one server as the database server as well as the web server, then you'll never need to change this. I think Jason mentioned my ISAM as being, up until recently anyways, a better choice of how to store your tables in MySQL. Again, if it works, there's no need to change it. For advanced sysadmins, you may want to investigate my ISAM versus InnoDB and their strengths and weaknesses. The other thing that we talked about, and you had to enter this password when you ran the script, was the username and the password that WeBWorK uses to talk to the database. So, again, I've picked a very secure password here because this machine will never get outside my, my desktop computer here. But WeBWorK, when it connects, it tries this password. Beyond that, things down here, you probably don't need to change much. You'll notice that I didn't set up a mail SMTP server and SMTP sender because I'm not using this as a real server, but this is something that you're going to have to, it's possible it will work with localhost, though more and more campuses are blocking outgoing mail unless it uses their SMTP server, because if you installed a richer set of packages on your Linux machine, it probably included a mail server. So localhost may work for you, but again, it may not get through your university's firewalls, things like that. It's one of those things where you're going to have to check with your IT people as to how to do that. Scroll down. If you've installed the problem library, you can set it here. Again, these can also be set, the libraries can also be set in local overrides, which gets read later on. Last couple things you may want to send here are time zone and locale. So time zone, obviously, you can look these up online. There's a command here to get the list of available time zones, but anyone who's installed a Linux system enough times has probably learned what the code is for theirs. I know mine is America/Edmonton for Mountain Time in Canada. And the last one on here that might be of interest to you is locale. And this is particularly if you're going to be running WeBWorK in a different language. You can set it to show dates using your native language. So for example, if the date format is different, you can set the date format. And Linux is very good if you've installed the right packages at knowing the names of the days of the week, the names of the months in whatever language you set here. So that's the things in site.conf. Typically, site.conf is something you don't need to mess with after you've got your server up and running. So once your server's running the way you like it to, the rest is just customization, and customization you're going to actually do in localoverrides.conf. So having said that, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at defaults.config, because if there's any settings you don't like in defaults.config, what you're going to do is you're going to either look for the corresponding thing in localoverrides.conf or you're going to copy it to localoverrides.conf. So this is a very long file. It has basically the default behavior of everything in WeBWorK. There's much of this that you're not going to want to change. You'll notice right away, the first thing it does is it reads site.conf and then goes on from there to change anything. So again, I'll keep emphasizing this. Do not edit defaults.config, because if you try to upgrade, it will make your upgrade more challenging and it will break things when you upgrade. So let's just scroll through this. Mail settings, again, this is something that is now handled more so at the course level, so you probably don't need to worry about that. Feedback verbosity, if you are getting email from students, you can set things like what you want the subject line to read, including a bunch of variables here. You can also set how much information you want to include in the emails that you get from students. Things like the mail editor, when you go to the email instructor screen, how many rows and columns you want on that. There's tons of things in here. I'm not going to go through all of them. This is relatively new. If you want Git to notify, or if you want WeBWorK to notify you when there's new versions, then you have to set this information correctly. Again, you'll want to actually make these changes in local overrides. Themes are something that Jeff is probably going to talk more about tomorrow. There's the Math 4 theme, which is what you see, the colors, the images, or the logos, things like that. are handled by the theme and the theme template. If you want to customize those, you can. Sorry, not tomorrow. Next Monday. And then there's enabling achievements, things like the editor. Show Me Another is another relatively new feature. I believe it's new in WeBWorK 2.10, which allows students to get a different version of the problem they're working on with different numbers and see the solution. And again, only applies where there are solutions, things like that. These things, again, you probably shouldn't change because they're dependent on other variables. So just change them at the highest level and you don't have to worry about that. All of these things, again, this stuff, there's not a lot of reason to change. And again, if your courses are in weird places, you may want to change this. We'll get to that. I'm going to scroll down because the things that you may want to change are some of the permissions and things like that. So this is something that I've actually changed on my server, and I'll show you that in localoverrides.conf. You get the default header file with your WeBWorK set. So if you don't set a header file, then that information it prints at the top of the printouts and that it shows you on the right are set there, are in this file. And again, you can customize that file, or you can just move it to a different location. Tons of configuration. This is something that Mike finished with at the end of the morning session, is that you can add library buttons. So again, maybe we'll do that in local overrides once I get to there. Statuses, again, something you may or may not need to change are enrolled, audit, drop, proctor. Typically, they're good enough for you, unless there's a reason to change them. And then we get into some database stuff, which again has been moved to site.conf. This is where we're pulling in the database configuration, which again, something you shouldn't mess with unless you have some really outstanding reason to. Database layouts. There is only one database layout currently supported in WeBWorK, and that's SQL Single. Historically, there were other things where it was sharing a database with Moodle, but right now this is the only database that is implemented in WeBWorK. Problem library, again here, the default, and this should probably be changed at this point, is for the old NPL. This is, again, something that is, if you have a recent version of localoverrides.conf.dis that you've used to start your system, it's changed there. So 2.5 is the most recent version of the problem library. You have to tell it where to find it and which version you're using so it knows how to generate the list of topics and things like that. Log files. Again, the timing log is an interesting one because it, well, Mike went through this at one point last week, I believe, tells you how long it takes for WeBWorK to serve requests. It also starts to fill up very quickly because every time someone loads a page, it adds a line to this log file. So if you're going to leave this on, you're going to want to get into log rotate, which I'm going to get to in a little while. Various log files, again, if you want to put these somewhere else because your server has logs backed up or rotated or something like that, then you can do that here. But typically it makes sense to have the course-based logs, that is the answer log and the login log, within the individual course.
And you would want to make these changes in local overrides, I think.
Yes. Yeah. I'll keep saying that. Do not mess with this file. Anything you do change, you're going to cut and paste from here into local overrides and then change it there. Roles are an interesting one because this is something you may actually want to configure. If you have different levels of people in your institution, then you may need more roles in this. And I'll show you in a minute that there's certain permissions that I know when I run a server, I will change. They picked sort of the default generic ones, right? There's guest, which has less permissions than everyone, student, Proctors are for proctored gateway quizzes. We aren't really going to get into gateways. It's something that you can look up online, but basically timed tests. You can have them proctored to where someone has to log in for a student to start it, and someone has to log in for a student to submit it. So there's permission levels associated with that. Your typical TA has less permissions than a professor. Apparently Mike was wrong that admins have a higher permission level than professors. But I don't think they have any actual different permissions at the moment. But what you can do now is you can look down at these permission levels. And again, this is something where you read it in defaults.config, and then if you see something you want to change, you put it in localoverrides.conf. So there are pages and pages of permissions here. And starting from the very basic, which is can even log in. And again, these are all hierarchical. So if we go back to these permissions, if you have a higher permission number, you can do anything that anyone with a lower permission number can do. And your permission is course-based. So you may be a professor in one course and a student in another course. So login, again, why would you, typically on the site-wide level, you'd either set this to guest or student because, it doesn't make sense to have students not be able to log into courses. At an individual course level, this is something that we have actually changed on courses. For example, an instructor finishes a course and then wants students to no longer have access to it, but he still wants to get into it to look at his old assignments or to check how students did. At the course level, and we'll get to that in a minute, you can change these permission levels so that for an individual course, only TAs are better or only instructors are better can log in. One thing we've changed in ours, because we're using external authentication, is we've set change password to nobody because we want them to change their password using the university system rather than the WeBWorK system, because if they try to change it in WeBWorK, it won't change it for all of their stuff. Again, all of these things, they're supposed to be self-explanatory. If they're not, then there's not a ton of documentation. You might have to just try them and see what happens. I will see if I can find the one that I like to change here. This one here. There are often times where a student comes to a TA and says, I did this in WeBWorK and it marked it wrong and I'm sure it's right. And as an instructor, you have the ability to act as that student and see what they typed in and check their past answers. So we want our TAs to be able to do that too, because we don't want them to have to contact the instructor every time a student says, no, this is what my question said, or this is what I entered. So this is one that I'm actually going to change in local overrides once I scroll through the rest of this file. And again, there's tons of these. You can read all these, decide what you want to do. It's worth, if you have an hour at some point, reading through all of these configuration things and seeing if there's anything here that makes sense for you to change. You may decide that you want to give your TAs more power or less power. That's something you can easily do from here. It's also something you can do with instructors. In fact, if you want, you can add another permission level for course coordinator, where the course coordinator can open and close sets or edit sets, and then the instructors can only look at them or download grades, things like that, if you don't trust the individual instructors in a specific course. So again, we won't read through all of this. There are a huge number of things here that you may want to change. Answer defaults for PG. If you want to set your tolerance on the server to be better or worse, you can do that. Show editors, again, there's different versions of the homework sets editor, the library browser, the class list editor, and the problem editor. You can turn these on or off depending on what you want to do. And again, all sorts of options here, which we won't go into great detail on. But let's look at localoverrides.conf. No, I guess I don't know next. So this one I'm actually editing rather than just viewing because there are changes I want to make. Again, I'm logged in as root. Typically, you should want to be sudoing this because this file should not be writable by the web group. The web server should not be allowed to write its configuration file. That's a security no-no. So again, we saw a lot of these things in defaults.config, but if you change them here, it'll override whatever happens in defaults.config. The other thing is you want to leave defaults.config alone because if a new version comes out, there may be new things that need to be in there, and you need to get those from Git. So things that you may want to change here, your language. Again, there's been a lot of work on localizing this to several languages. It tells you where to look for those languages that are available. This is one we're going to change. Right, siteinfo.txt is something that I will bounce over to my actual WeBWorK server here. Kick up the font size on this so you can hopefully read this. So here's the front page of my brand new WeBWorK server, and this is what the world gets to see. Is siteinfo.txt, the file says this file is at blah, blah, blah. The reason it's a good idea to change the path to this file and not just edit this file is because this file is part of the Git repository. And therefore, when you upgrade to a new version of WeBWorK, it will do its best to blow away whatever you put in this exact file with the Git version of it. So the safest thing to do is to siteinfo myserver.txt. So I'll save that change. I'm going to open another terminal window here. Just because I'm in the middle of editing that file and I don't want to go away from that. And now I will go to WeBWorK 2, and I'll check where I put that, the htdocs directory, which is htdocs. And there you see siteinfo.txt. And if I read the contents of that file, you'll see it's exactly what I saw on the web server. .txt is kind of a misnomer here because it actually renders as HTML. So you'll notice that for those of you that know HTML, this is an HTML comment, which is why I don't see it on the web server. So I can copy the default one into whatever I called it in my window here. I called it siteinfo myserver.txt. And then I will edit that file. And I'll change the text to something that makes sense here. Again, what I found this file useful for is if you, for example, are using external authentication for your server. So if I reload this window now, and again, this is a virtual machine on my local machine. It doesn't have a lot of resources, so it takes forever to reload pages. But this is one thing, because it's just reading a text file, you don't need to restart your server in order for this to take changes. So one use of this is if you're using external authentication or you want to tell students how to log in, you can put that here, right? So you can say, welcome to WeBWorK, click on the last name of your instructor or whatever convention you use for naming your courses. So they will see that if they come to this main WeBWorK page. Again, more and more places, it seems, are building their own custom HTML page and just ignoring this page altogether. That's another option, but this siteinfo.txt, if anyone goes to the web, they will see this, so it's worth changing. So that's one change I'm going to make here that I've already made is the siteinfo. As I said, I've written some custom header files, which I put in different locations, so you can set those because they may be specific to your university. You know, there says it has some generic information about how to answer WeBWorK questions, some links to where to get help. But if you want to put links that show up on every printout to, your help room, where to find your instructor, things like that, then you can edit those header files. So you'll notice here we see these problem library version. This says 2.5, whereas defaults.config said 2. This one wins because it gets read later. Again, I can flip back to that slide. The first thing is site.conf, then defaults.config, then localoverrides.conf. So localoverrides.conf beats the ones above it. Therefore, it's going to respect this when it does these things. I'm not sure why that's in there twice, but it is. Again, and if you've installed the problem library somewhere else on your hard drive, then you're going to have to change this directive here. Here's where you actually want to make changes to these library buttons. So, for example, we use the Rochester problems quite often. If I do this, I don't have to create any symlinks. So this is just, if you don't want to have people search through the whole OPL and you want them to just search through the Rochester subdirectory of the OPL, you can do this. But also, if, as Mike said, you were to have installed the Kappa problems, you could just uncomment this last line. Whoops. And it would then put a button for the Kappa. Wonder if, so if I go to my test course.
You will need to link Kappa library if you do it that way.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You will need to create. This is all, it looks for all of these things in the templates directory of the course. So because there is already a directory called template/library/Rochester, this link that I've added will work. Have I saved this? So right away here I see a Rochester button. And if I remember correctly, these only work if it finds the directory. So now instead of getting the entire OPL worth of directories, I just get the Rochester worth of directories. And again, there's a couple of collections we use often. We use the Rochester one and the ones we've written at our university at UC. So there's buttons for those on my production server. But again, if you want just certain subdirectories of your library or of your templates directory, you can do that here. Now let's talk about permissions, right? So they've got a couple examples here to get you started, with one of them being actually activated by default, and that is permission levels don't log past answers. It's overriding whatever's in defaults.config and saying it's undefined, meaning that this happens for nobody. So nobody doesn't log past answers, meaning it's logging past answers for everyone. I wanted to change a couple of these, like, what did I want to change now? Can I remember? So, for example, here, if I want to disable guest logins for the whole server, I can basically copy this previous line above me and just take the right name of the permission from here. So the permission is login, and I want to set this to student. So what this will do is this will disable guest logins for every course on my server. And again, as I said, you can go through this whole big list of things, and you can say, what do you want students to be able to do? What do you want TAs to be able to do? What do you want instructors to be able to do? Again, you can take anything you want from the defaults.config and override it here. Just be careful with some of the more esoteric ones. If they aren't cosmetic, then you have to be really careful about the implications of changing these things. Display modes. So you'll notice that plain text is commented out here because displaying the LaTeX source to a student isn't all that useful. This is sometimes handy for debugging, though nowadays MathJax, if you I believe it's right-click or mouse over, it will give you the raw LaTeX for that. So That's one thing. MapJax now has sort of become the universally accepted best option for displaying images in WeBWorK. There was a time where certain things didn't get along, and you may have had to, depending on the circumstances, certain things work better with images mode, certain things work better in MapJax mode. If you're really ambitious, you can turn off images mode altogether. I believe all of the problems in the OPL work with MapJax, so it shouldn't be an issue. One thing to be careful about when using images mode is that when you use images mode, it is running LaTeX on the server for every equation and generating an image and then serving that image to students. So it puts a huge load on your server because it's running LaTeX a bunch of times and you're serving a whole bunch more images. Plus those images get stored on the server. I'll come back to that in a little while because there's a way to clean them up, which takes up more disk space. So what I'm getting at is, unless you have some outstanding reason to, leave the default display mode as MapJax. In fact, again, as I said, you may even turn off images. Macros, if you have additional macros that apply to your problems or problems that you've got from a third party. At one point, there was a set of problems going with the Wiley-Anton text and a set of problems going with the Rogowski text from Freeman that required their own macros. You may want to add another place to look for macros. And again, there's instructions that come with those libraries. If not, you can find answers to that on the forums. Applets, if you are using Java applets or Flash applets or things like that, you sometimes have to add locations for that. These ones are handy. If you always use the same max attempts or typically use the same max attempts per problem and it isn't unlimited, you may want to set that here. So, for example, if your assignments all have 5 attempts per question, you set this to 5, then whenever you add a problem to a set, it's set to 5 attempts rather than an infinite number. Again, I talked about these in default.config, but if you uncomment Library Browser 2 and Library Browser 3, which are not fully supported, you can take a look at how they do. They allow you to drag and drop problems, but they're not 100% reliable on all the functionality. Again, more stuff, and I know Jeff mentioned this as well when he was looking through this. If you're using LDAP, for example, or LTI to authenticate users, if you want to hook it into your university system rather than letting WeBWorK manage all the passwords, then you'd uncomment one of these, and you'd also have to go to that file in the conf directory and add whatever configuration applies specifically to your server. And that's, again, the idea. So we've made a couple of changes here that will change it globally. So we'll get out of this, and then we'll talk about the next thing down, which is changing things for, a specific course. So if there's something simple that you want to change for a specific course, the first thing to do is log into that course and see if you can do it on the web. So here I am logged into my course. At the bottom of the Instructor Tools menu is Course Configuration. So the most common things you need to change are available through the web interface. These go in the file simple.conf, which you shouldn't edit on the command line. You should let this interface manage that file. So for example, if all of your courses are in New York, but you have a colleague in another city that wants a test course, you can override the time zone for just that one course here. Same thing with the course info, which I can go back and show you, is on the login page and on the front page when you log in. Things like this. Notice here that there's also, this is easy to miss, different categories at the top. One thing that some instructors do is, depending on what kind of students you have, you may or may not want them to be able to email you, and you may want more or less information from you. So the default here is to send the emails to TAs, but if you don't want your TAs answering emails, you can set this to professor, things like that. You can mess with the problem displays. Again, we saw in global.conf, or sorry, not global.conf, I'm living in the past. In local overrides, we had map Jackson images. You can turn that off for just your course. For example, if you had some course that was using fancy LaTeX in its problems and MapJax couldn't handle it, you may want to change the default in that particular course to images. So these are all things that you can fool around with. There's not a lot of things that you can actually break here. This is one of them. And this comes up perennially on the forums, where someone changes allowed to log into the course to a permission higher than themselves. The only way to fix that is to have shell access to your server. If I change this course, if I change this to admin or to nobody, then even with my professor account, I can't log in. So just be careful about that. The other thing now is that the default is student, right? I changed that in local override, so the system default is student, but in this course, I could lower that to guest. So on the server, by default, it's only students and higher that can log in. But this is my one sample course, and I want guests to be able to log in, so I changed that to guest and save changes. Again, you can turn off things for students, or you can turn on things for students, right? Reporting bugs means reporting bugs to the WeBWorK bug system. We typically don't have that as students because, in my experience, they don't understand the difference between a bug and their mistake. They don't understand the question, and they think it's a bug in the system, which is why, by default, we want someone who knows a bit more about WeBWorK reporting bugs to WeBWorK. So again, all things you can change here. Feel free to look around these, configure whatever you want. If you want something that is not on one of these 5 pages, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages, then you can still configure anything that we saw in defaults.config for a specific course, but if you want to do anything beyond these 5, you need server access. Well, that's a lie. You will need server access in the near future. So if I want to change something for a specific course, now I'm in OPT WeBWorK, I want to go off WeBWorK courses, find the course I want. I only have one course here. It's called test course. In that test course directory, I see 2 configuration files, course.conf and simple.conf. So, as I said, simple.conf, in fact, if I read this, it warns you not to mess with it. Right? It says it's automatically generated, so don't change it. If you want to change something at the command line, use course.conf. And you'll notice this is the change that I made through the web interface just now. So that they're saved exactly the same as they would be in course.conf. It just writes it to another config file. So if I look at course.conf, there is a bit of default stuff in there. Right? So it will print file names for all of the instructors in that course, which means that those of you who have used WeBWorK, you've seen this. When I'm logged in as an instructor and I go to do a problem, it gives me the path to that file. So it shows me which PG file I'm actually using. Again, you can make that happen for less people or for more people if you'd like as well. Again, so if there's something here I wanted to change for just this course that wasn't in the web interface, here's where I'd add it. And I do the same thing I did with local overrides. If it was already in there, I'd just change it. If it wasn't, then I'd cut and paste that line and put it into this file. And it would only apply to this course. So that's the basics of customizing the configuration for any of the server or individual courses.